This exhibition aims to illustrate Roma or Gypsy life over the last 1.5 centuries. It also seeks answers to questions such as how can the extremely differentiated Gypsy society which lives in this region guard its ethnic identity among existing social and political conditions? How does it express the characteristics of Gypsy or Roma culture? And how does it establish the framework of a national culture that embraces the largest possible number of Gypsies? It is evident that this exhibition is not able to present all groups of Gypsies and all the problems they face. But we would like to demonstrate the most important characteristics, historical facts, and structural elements with case studies and examples. Obviously, the presentation of Gypsies is not simply the presentation of an ethnic culture in itself, since the political structure of the region, the relationship between the authorities and the Gypsies, and the role of the Gypsies in the division of labour all fundamentally determine the cultural and social situations of the various Gypsy groups.
Pois caminta lá, vulcaile lá, ele tu chacai mai dela. Ai potam tu chacai mirela, potam tu chacai mirela. Capesi de canașela, capesi de canașela. Acala meriva chi, mulunga bezeli, tenere de acá,
The image of gypsies created in the 19th century has affected the way society sees them right to this day. In the second part of the 19th century, we find two distinguishable gypsy images in the fine arts, literature, science and the press. These images were and are derived from the ways gypsy groups relate to the society as a whole and its social and economic order. These were and are basically divided between those Roma which form working relationships with the majority of society and its institutions, both with written and unwritten rules. Then there are others which seek to maintain their autonomy, whatever the circumstances, and which stay outside the institutional system of society and its formalized economy and patterns of life, indeed, often resisting its values and standards. In spite of these differences, gypsies are mainly represented in a romantic, exotic, yet often condescending terms. Thus, the gypsy image is not as the gypsies see themselves, but as people from outside see or imagine they see them. The young photographers of the 1970s, who were familiar with the sociological research of the time, held the system responsible for the social handicap of the gypsies. By pointing at poverty, they could demonstrate that there was also poverty under socialism, and in this way they became opponents of the political system. The Holocaust is without doubt the most painful era in gypsy history. After Hitler gained power in 1935, the solution to the Roma question began to be methodically applied in Nazi Germany. To ensure the supposed racial purity of the German nation, a census was made amongst gypsies, who were adjudged to have genetically inherited a criminal attitude. Their free movement was restricted, and after 1939, they were deported to the recently occupied Eastern Territories. Intimidation and persecution, such as sporadic murders, were followed by internment in ghettos with the Jews, with whom they were forced to build concentration camps. However, once in the camps, the gypsies were given privileges. Their families were kept together, their belongings were not stolen, and their hair not cut. And they could spend money in the canteen. Thus were their suspicions allayed. Only the black triangle sewed on their clothes with the letter Z for Zigeuner, and the numbers tattooed on their body identified them as different. Jewish survivors of Auschwitz told of how they could hear the gypsy violins playing in Block 18 until the winter of 1943. After that, there was silence, a deathly silence. In all the countries of the region, the Wallachian or Ola tribes, groups which speak Romani, have maintained a roving, nomadic lifestyle longer than any others. They have also maintained their linguistic independence and ethnic characteristics. Ola gypsies, who call themselves Rom, are divided into several tribes, which practice different occupations and use different dialects. The most well-known groups are the Keldari, who are tinsmiths and coppersmiths, the Lovari, who are horse dealers, the Churari, who make knives, the Kolari, mainly carpet dealers, and the Gubari, who make saucepans and are potters. The Keldarari live in the eastern part of the region, while the Lovari group live mainly in the west. The tribal culture of other groups has been integrated by these two during the last century. In Romania, Bulgaria, and the Ukraine today, there are still Keldaras groups that periodically move around, although there have been attempts everywhere to make the gypsies settle down. The Stănescu family, which we see in these pictures, live in stone houses in Galaz, Moldova County in wintertime, and in big tents in Transylvania in the summer. In the classical nomadic period, the groups could number up to 100 people, but sometimes only a couple of families formed a group. Typically, groups contain 20 to 40 people. They are usually members of the same extended family who look back to the same ancestor. They travelled with horses and wagons and lived in large tents. Tinsmiths would wander in pursuit of their trade, moving as far as demand required. They were considered rich compared to the other wandering tribes, owing to the demand for their products. This and their extremely strong group identity explains their system of costumes and their endogamy in marriage. Being wanderers, they invested their wealth into mainly smaller objects, particularly silver jewellery. The most characteristic of gypsy occupations that are practiced to this day include fortune-telling, animal training, and the practice of magic. Some time ago, these activities inspired both fear and respect among the non-gypsy inhabitants. The figure of the gypsy fortune-teller woman, as well as the figure of the magician, is a frequent motif in European painting. Gypsy women, who are famous for their prophetic abilities, are very popular among both rural and urban populations. The fortune-teller has inevitably to touch upon the desires, insecurities and hidden fears of the person seeking his or her destiny. The fortune-teller strengthens people's feelings that their present social and material existence is not definitive and can only get better. Thus the fortune-teller can mobilize a person. The positive image of the future created by the fortune-teller can be explained to some extent as using the principle of the self-fulfilling prophecy. The gypsy magician uses similar ideas. In Poland, gypsy women made figures of the devil or skeletons from stereo or wax. They used black crucifixes or chicken bones wrapped in hair, and they would go from house to house with this kind of paraphernalia in their hands, and predicting illness or other problems would come upon the inhabitants of the houses. They would agree to find and drive away any supposed evil item that they came upon. The frightened house owner would inevitably pay the gypsy women to take away the terrible object once they found it and bury it. In Smogorny, Lithuania, a so-called bear academy, a school for bear training, existed until the end of the 18th century, and this was led by gypsies who lived on the lands of Prince Radziwill. In the summertime, these bear-leading gypsies wandered from country to country, presenting shows with trained bears and monkeys. In the Baltic states, even today, one can meet gypsies with trained bears. In all the countries of the region, from Bulgaria to Slovakia, there are gypsies whose mother tongue is a form of Romanian dating from before the language changes of the last century. These gypsies, the beaș, are traditionally occupied with woodwork of different kinds, particularly trough making. That the groups are linked by a common Romanian mother tongue suggests that the nomadic woodworkers originated from Romania probably in the 18th or 19th centuries. Their wanderings were determined both by the need for raw materials and by the market forces of the day. They settled, usually on farms, until they found the necessary wood for their products. Their temporary settlements were mostly outside villages, in forests or on riverbanks, and they remained there until they had completed their orders or supplies of raw material had run out. These groups were formed of families who all lived together. The group would produce and market troughs, basins, wooden spoons, matchwood and spindles. They managed their activity in a most economical manner. From one piece of wood, they sought to produce as much as they could, so they made a big variation of tools of different sizes and with different functions. Later, these gypsies, still living from trough making and woodwork, settled down, and some tried to guarantee their living in other ways. The first who settled formed their permanent dwellings in the forests, from where they went out for agricultural day labour. After 1945, and particularly in the 1950s, communities designated places near villages for the gypsies to live, and new closed settlements were formed. The gypsies continued to work in handicraft activities, making products which were not produced by large-scale industry and which could be used on small peasant farms. From the 1950s, their main source of livelihood was provided by agricultural integration, when gypsies joined agricultural cooperatives and state farms as employees, or found jobs in mining, construction, or the metal industries. We first learn about Roma blacksmiths from sources in the 16th century. The majority of gypsy blacksmiths practiced their craft as itinerant artisans, though some were permitted to settle in certain towns where they worked for the local inhabitants. These gypsies worked in an archaic way, in a squatting or sitting position. They used scrap material to produce a whole range of products, including nails, chains, agricultural implements, timber processing tools, traps, and special knives. Usually they were paid in kind. The smiths who settled owned small workshops and were paid in cash. Customers would go and pick up the products they had ordered directly from the blacksmiths, while Roma women also went from village to village, hawking their products. The good relationships formed between the Roma smiths and the peasants allowed the blacksmiths to become intermediaries between the Roma and the Gajo, or non-gypsy, world. Gypsy blacksmiths adapted to local demands, and in some communities they became specialized, beginning to produce to order in larger and larger quantities. In the 19th century, smithery was the most widespread of Roma occupations. Traditional Roma smithery began to be pushed to the periphery by industrial production from the beginning of the century. Mass-produced products became affordable to the rural population, destroying the Roma blacksmith market. Only a few blacksmiths were able to continue their work, usually as farriers or on repair work to carriages and agricultural implements. In modern times, the blacksmiths in the Slovak town of Donojska Luzna, near Bratislava, have become famous for their skills. Here, the Rigo, Sárközi and Radl families have worked as blacksmiths for the last 200 years. From 1989, they have begun to use their experiences gained on cooperative farms to produce from their own small business units. Today, over 150 Roma, including designers, draftsmen and blacksmiths, produce more than 200 types of products, such as metal furniture and music stands, which are sold in the markets of Italy, Austria and Germany. Gypsies have been working as musicians throughout the region since the 18th century. But the music they play is not from their own folk tradition, separate from the mainstream music of the dominant population. Thus the repertoire serves the musical tastes of the peasants as well as the entertainment of the ruling classes. There are occasional references to gypsy musicians in Hungary from the 16th and 17th centuries. The musicians in those days were individual players. The first reference to gypsy bands comes from the second part of the 18th century. These bands initially were in the service of landowners and minor nobles, or lived in citizen towns. The music, which originally served noble tastes, became more and more popular among the bourgeoisie and the peasants rising into the middle class. According to our sources, musicians at the end of the 18th century usually had two jobs, combining their music with such trades as smithery or brickmaking to make ends meet. The 19th century saw big differences begin to appear between the various gypsy musical groups. Many village gypsy musicians could only get occasional income from their instruments when they played at peasant weddings or feasts. These Roma would survive mainly from agricultural work or brickmaking. The other group consisted of professional musical families, playing music that had evolved through generations. Typically, they became permanent employees of restaurants, inns and hotels, and they also accepted a considerable amount of mobility as well, appearing in places where gypsy musicians had never played before. Their music gained considerable popularity, and at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, they left not only for Western Europe, but also for North America. In our exhibition, the Fatjol family from Moko near Szeged illustrate this process perfectly. In Hungary, interest in gypsy music began to wane in the 1950s, partly as a result of political pressure and partly due to the influence of modern music fashions. Thus, the demand for Roma musicians fell away sharply, and people had to find other work. The Roma in agricultural areas initially took up seasonal work or offered their services to peasants, and could thus get a limited income. Later, industrial piecework jobs produced a modest income for others. But finally, in the late 1980s, many of these unskilled industrial jobs were lost, and unemployment has soared amongst the Roma. Those gypsies who worked in large-scale agriculture in the socialist era have fared somewhat better, many gaining a living from agricultural smallholding production with the onset of democracy and a market economy. After the Second World War, the structure of agricultural property throughout the region was transformed, and consequently, gypsies living from agriculture lost their livelihoods. Initially, the extensive socialist industrialization programs absorbed only the peasant population of the countryside, and the 1950s brought unprecedented poverty for the majority of gypsies. The poorly educated, unemployed gypsies lived in miserable settlements consisting of tiny little houses well separated from the majority population, and they found themselves left out from the process of social equalization at the beginning of the communist era. However, their marked poverty questioned the declared values of the socialist system to the point of compromising it. Realizing this, the communist parties in the region and the local authorities tried to find ways of improving the gypsies' lot. Usually, however, they were treated not as an ethnic group, but as a poor class needing education and employment opportunities to achieve the communist government's goal of social integration. Administrative decisions were partly assisted by the forced and continuing socialist industrialization, which began to absorb the inexpensive, unskilled manpower in greater numbers. The plans to improve education for gypsy children, however, achieved only partial success, and many failed to finish even elementary school. As a result, they were rarely able to significantly improve on the living standards of their parents. The other main strand of social development was aimed at the improvement of housing. The segregated settlements were knocked down in several places, and new buildings, supposedly modern, were built in their place. These new flats, though offering some improvements, like electricity for example, were still very basic, and usually lacked even running water and heating. And yet again, these new houses were located in separated parcels of land, which effectively maintained segregation between the gypsy community and other members of society. With low incomes, the Roma had little chance of bettering their position and leaving these settlements, and nor were the new generation able to build houses either. Throughout the region, the democratic changes and moves to a market economy, which first surfaced in the mid-1980s, have been accompanied by massive cuts in low-skilled job opportunities. Gypsy workers, even those with skills in such industries as construction, road building and mining, have suffered disproportionately in the layoffs. Many large families are now living below the poverty line, their main sources of income consisting of child benefit payments and the grey economy, such as unregistered trading jobs. Others pick from rubbish tips for scrap, and there is always the so-called subsistence crime groups. Most Roma who are economically successful in modern society seek to emphasize their new status and social roles in their lifestyles. In the Kelderash tribe, the most successful people become self-appointed kings and surround themselves with the attributes of a royal role. Florin Cioba, from Sibiu in central Romania, claims to inherit the royal title his father created. He aims to fulfill his father's wish to build a Roma museum and an Orthodox church. In their own eyes, a true Roma is a man of independence, although their work in practice is unimaginable without a system of relations with the non-gypsy Gajo majority. Trading is viewed as an ideal occupation to maintain this perceived independence, and economic success is inevitably flaunted with jewellery or expensive cars, for example. The less successful Roma, however, denounce such demonstrations of wealth, saying it does not form part of a true gypsy culture. For those who consider themselves successful amongst the Roma, a wedding is the ideal community occasion to present their new social status to society and the family group. At the same time, the celebration is an honour of the young couple, as well as a memory and a pledge of the survival of the Roma and holiness of the family. feasts form the basis for ritual meetings for the tribes and their relatives. People pray to the Holy Virgin for good health and luck as they wash themselves in the holy spring, before whispering a prayer for the souls of their dead. They find the occasion of being together important, as it encourages mutual respect. The music, dance, food and drinks all contribute to an unforgettable and convivial atmosphere. Funerals and burial feasts that others might consider an indulgence represent a homage to the dead person and his or her social standing, and provide assistance to their journey to the next world. The mourners also represent a measure of the respect for the deceased by their very presence. So, the funeral becomes an expression of the standard of values of the people and the community. A great person will certainly have a great funeral. The burial chamber built for the dead person and the objects placed in it, which serve the next life, are traditional Roma customs. As an old gypsy saying puts it, there can be no fair without the Roma, but the Roma can't live without a fair. For them, a fair is a place to bargain and haggle, to find success or luck, or even to get one up on the dreaded gajo. Fairs are also the place to be for coppersmiths, trough makers, the woodworkers, the beash, the smiths, the wandering artisans, and for all those with knowledge of herbal medicines. A fair, too, is unimaginable without showmen, whether they come with dancing bears or a shooting range. And of course, there is the obligatory fortune teller. Horse dealers are another essential feature of any fair, and they are forever ready to challenge the peasants to a so-called duel. The gypsy is the winner of the duel if he can buy the peasant's horse at below the market price. Nowadays, more and more people are engaged in dealing with horses of quality, and they can cover long distances from the cheap fair sites to the more expensive ones in order to gain a bargain. To a certain extent, trading with second-hand cars can be said to derive from horse dealing. It certainly uses many of the same skills. Clothes, tobacco, coffee and alcohol dealers abound, always in search of cheap sources and places to sell on at a profit.
Valamikor régebben még kisebb voltam, olyan 7-8 éves, hogy egy-egy vándorszekor ekhósan még mentek az úton, és kimentem közéjük. És nem voltak azok az emberek, mint aminek tartották mások, hogy zsiványok és tolvajok. Nem. Itt nem lehetett beszélni, hogy 100%-ra. Itt esetleg lehetett beszélni egy olyan 10-15%-ról, ha akik ebbe a csoportba tartoztak, hogy zsiványok és tolvajok. De azok az emberek becsületes munkájuk által tartották fenn magukat és családukat, akik állandó jelleggel az ég alatt volt az otthonuk, a kis sátrukba és az ekhós kocsijukba. Ezeknek ez volt az életük.
500 éve, talán több, hogy ez a cigány kisebbség valahonnan Ázsiából, hátsó vagy előindiából ide keveredett. De én mondhatom azt, én önmagam felett is ítéletet mondok, mert cigány vagyok. De amit a cigányok abban az időben műveltséget, kultúrát, vagy egyéb civilizációbeli dolgot hoztak magukkal, az még mindig megvan nekik. Ebből nem mozdultak sehova. A sok közül egy-két valaki, ugye csak kicsillan, de ez is elvész. Ez is elvész. Én cigány vagyok. És az ítéletet én magam felett is kimondtam, mert én se tudtam mozdulni innen sehova. No, de nekem volt olyan világom, hogy a többi cigánynak arról sejtelmesebb.
Van egy létező dolog. Ezt komolyan kell venni. Le van írva. Nem vagyok vallásos ember. Nem vagyok különböző liturgiák rabja. De tudom, hogy van a világon egy nagy csoda. Ezt a csodát többen meg akarták jeleníteni. Ezzel a csodáért sokan meghaltak. Ezt úgy hívják, hogy szeretet.
A sértésekre tényleg az a legjobb válasz, hogyha az ember valami nagyon-nagyon humoros képet vált, vagy legalább vicsorogni próbál. Ha szükségünk lenne mostanában békére, ezért festek. Tehát én nagyon-nagyon szívesen mondanám egy pár politikával és más az emberekkel foglalkozó tudománybíró embernek, hogy fessen, vagy verseket írjon, vagy zenéljen. Rendkívül jó lehetőség a lelki tisztulásra. Szükségük van rá.
Táncos kedve a lábamba, de addig járom, amíg bírom, de akkor úgyis abba.
It was about 20 years ago that Roma artists and their work first made an impact in the world of Hungarian art. This was when they were presented at the first exhibition of self-taught Roma artists. Similar events soon took place in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and later in Romania and Bulgaria, as the trend for artistic expression amongst the Roma strengthened. Today, works by Roma artists have developed their own special characteristics and styles, and form an important development in the changing face of Roma culture in every country in the region.
Az embereknek van egy nagy hibájuk, hogy a lelkiket belülről nem nézik meg, hogy milyen belül, mert mindenkinek tiszta volna. És én tudom, hogy cigány származású vagyok, de nem tudom azt, hogy mi az a cigány. Embernek érzem magam olyannak, mint a többi. Ugyanúgy.